Hello, everyone, and welcome to History Matters and So Does Coffee. What I was about to say is last week when I was talking about documents, presidential records and such, there was another topic that came to mind that I thought that's next week's topic. And then I totally forgot it and went on Twitter yesterday and said, anyone remember what it is? And some of you did, thank you very much. And it was oh, there you go. I know, Annie, you had notes.
I take notes. This is my notebook for History Matters.
I was honored. I was honored.
All these pages of everything.
Well, thank you for the notes, and to others who reminded me that what I wanted to talk about was the shift in tone coming from the Democrats and what that suggests and what it means. And it was prompted by the snarky White House tweets about PPP loans in response to criticism of the student loan forgiveness plan. So that is indeed what I'm going to be talking about today. But before I talk about it, I will turn to my partner in crime, Annie, with the straightened hair, which looks very nice, who will explain the rules of the game.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Annie. I'm with New American History, which is out of the University of Richmond, and delighted to be with you every Friday as we engage with this community. Joanne mentioned, if you're new, please tell us you're new and put it in the chat so we know who you are, where you're from. We have a Slack channel, so we built this lovely community over the 126 episodes, I think.
That's true.
Is that right?
126
and
episodes.
So if you're new and you'd like to continue the conversation throughout the week, we have a Slack channel community. If you're a teacher, you can also, once you're in the Slack community, join what we call the Teachers Lounge, where we geek out on education-related conversations. So if you are interested, just put the word Slack in all caps, and then your name and email, and our lovely friend Reese, who manages it, will add you later today or tomorrow or sometime. John, our friend that we don't always see, he's the man behind the scene. He wanted me to
remind all possible.
Yeah, I want to remind you 2 important deadlines that I wrote in my notebook. September 24th is the Equity Summit. You do need to register, but it's like an all-day virtual event. It's free. And then the deadline to submit proposals for the NCHE conference is been extended to September 26th. Carol Lee and I are meeting Tuesday to work on our proposal. We hope you will also submit a proposal. So put your questions in the Q&A. I don't want to take up any more time. We're really excited to talk about this topic, Joanne. There was a lot of buzz on Twitter when you posted it. So just make sure that you engage in the chat for fun. But if you have a serious question, it's got to go in the Q&A. All right, we'll see you in a little bit.
And if you are engaging with our wonderful History Matters community in chat, remember to chat and make it accessible to everybody and not just panelists or hosts or whatever else it normally says. And
I forgot that.
I was going to say, but at this point, after 126 episodes, some part of my brain is like bing, bing, bing. And remember to keep it family friendly on chat. You're a family broadcast. Okay, so I do indeed want to talk about the shift in tone from the White House, which was prompted by those tweets, the White House tweets. And I'm going to come back to them in a minute. But part of what led me to think that those tweets were worth mentioning is there were other things happening around it, before it, after it, that struck me, historian that I am, as a pattern, right? It was a pattern in what Democrats are doing, and granted, in some ways, as the elections in November, as the midterms come closer, we'll be seeing more of this, I'm sure. But some of it, I think, is a shift in tone that is partly being prompted by the response to it, which to me, as a historian, that's the interesting part. So the pattern that I'm talking about, and some in the social media world refer to it as trolling, but it's not quite that. Going Goblin mode, that really bemuses me. It's the first time I've ever seen or used that phrase, so perhaps there's something I shouldn't say. Maybe there's some off-color aspect of it. I have no idea. But the idea that Democrats who normally are very civil and minding the rules are suddenly, releasing some level of snark it's a fascinating pattern. Before the White House tweets, and for those of you who didn't see them, this was when Republicans began speaking out against the student loan forgiveness plan, President Biden's student loan forgiveness plan. And the White House Twitter account, which is probably, they hired recently Megan Coyne as Deputy Director of Platforms in its Office of Digital Strategy. Wow, there's a string of words. Who apparently was, before that, worked for a New Jersey state-run account and was snappy and occasionally snarky. So although there's no absolute confirmation that she is responsible for those tweets, that is the word on the street, is that's her. And so what she or whoever did these tweets did was, every Republican who stepped forward, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, I have it here somewhere, there we are, stepped forward and said, you know, grumble, 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 student loan forgiveness. Why are we forgiving loans? And the tweet that came back said, added to it, Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene had $183,504 in PPP loans forgiven. And that's what these tweets did, was talk about how much each member of Congress who was criticizing this loan forgiveness had themselves had loan forgiveness. And that was snarky, and that was certainly not, and snarky in a, not in a horrible or terribly unfair way, but in a Twitter way, right? In a social media way. And that's not the tenor, certainly, of what the White House normally has done, but really overall what the Democrats have been doing. The other things that fall into this pattern, to me, is partly Beto O'Rourke shooting the MFer word, I'm not going to say it in our family-friendly show, at someone who heckled him when he was talking about the Uvalde shooting to a large audience, and someone heckled him, and he said, I think I have his quote here, the exact quote. I do. It may be funny to you, mother effer, but it's not funny to me, which got a big viral response. So there's Beto, there's the White House tweets, there's John Fetterman in Pennsylvania, who has that same tone in the way that he's attacking Mehmet Oz. You know, his ongoing joke that he's a guy from New Jersey running for office in Pennsylvania, and it's having an impact, right? People are responding, apparently, and I'll get back to this in a moment. Like the White House tweets, they have, people are responding, numbers of people are responding. People and also are stepping forward to support some of the people who are having this new tone. Apparently, in the White House tweets, nearly 200,000 people retweeted that thread of PPP tweets, and more than 700,000 liked it as of the Friday after it first started happening. The White House account gained more than 49,000 followers on Thursday, another 71,000 followers on Friday. Normally they get a couple of thousand gains per day. So it got a response, right? It got and which doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the standard from now on. But what's fascinating to me is partly the shift in tone, as I said, which probably we'll see more of it as we lead up to the midterms. Oh, and I should also add President Biden himself talking about semi-fascists. The tone of his oratory has shifted too. So the trend is interesting to me. The response to it was fascinating to me because of the patterns that I saw and discussed in my last book, Lurking Behind Me, The Field of Blood. Because what people were saying, particularly in response to the White House tweets, I saw all over the place, and people saying to me as well, essentially, finally, oh, excellent, like fight back, yay. You know, there were all these people who, it was like a rush of relief that the Democrats were finally not just standing by and appeasing and making everything nice, but actually were kind of coming back against the bullies in some way or another. And there was this rush of relief and satisfaction that people were expressing, that at least I saw in what I was reading and seeing on the part of the left. That was striking to me because the 1850s, if boy, we're just going to keep hearing about the 1850s, basically. And I've been talking about them and writing about them, actually, op-eds in the New York Times for years at this point. And the reason everyone keeps mentioning the 1850s is obviously because that's a time when politics was hyper polarized, when North and South each believed that their vision for America was the vision for America, and that the other side was increasingly over the course of the 1850s un-American in some ways. When the telegraph came into the political equation and scrambled politics in some ways, making everything happen faster as far as information spreading than had happened before, in the same way that social media came in recent years, partly because we had a president who tweets, scrambling everything. There are all kinds of ways in which the 1850s, the tenor of politics and the ethos of politics and the dynamic of politics and the implications of the politics are similar to what we're seeing now. But what's most striking to me is what happens in 1855 when there's a shift in tone among Northerners. Now, prior to the rise of the Northern Republican Party, it's a Northern party. Everyone in the party does not necessarily agree on slavery. Some want it abolished. Some just want it not to spread west. Some free soilers, abolitionists, or a bunch of people under the Republican umbrella. But it's a Northern party. Before that point, and it's part of what I wrote about in my book, Northerners were the appeasers. Northerners were the people who, when a Southerner threatened someone or hit someone or did something in Congress, in the House or Senate, that was obviously not following the rules, hostile, threatening, violent, the Northerners always stepped forward, one or at least some stepped forward and said, this is not according to the rules. We should not be behaving this way. Why are we not enforcing the rules? Perhaps we should strengthen the rules. So when you look at the long-term dynamic of Congress, 1830s, 1840s, and part of the 1850s, what you see is Southerners breaking rules and being threatening and violent, and Northerners somehow or other being given responsibility for keeping the institution running, respecting institutional boundaries and rules. Somehow or other, that was the balance for a time, was one side was the misbehaving, aggressive side. And because they were that, they and others expected, and even in a sense needed, the other side to really aggressively not be that. Right? The other side, the Northerners, were given, in a sense, responsibility to be caretakers of the system. Oh, well, they're not going to fight back. So on the one hand, Southerners could say, they can basically do whatever the heck we want. And it has an impact because they're not fighting back. They can't, they won't. They're responsible. They're doing what you're supposed to do. In 1855, when you get this Northern party, the new Republican Party, and they get to Congress, they very explicitly say, and I quote them a few times in the book, we're a different kind of Northerner. They will stand up. Someone will say something nasty about a Northerner in Congress, and that man, always at this point men, will stand up and say, yeah, no, you're not going to get away with that anymore. We're a different kind of Northerner. We don't sit down for that kind of abuse. We stand up. Like, you're in for something quite different. Now, the Republican Party came to power in part with the message, we are going to fight the slave power. By 1855, there had been a long history of people seeing, assuming, and watching in Congress a unified slave power defending slavery and dominating the government. The Republicans say, oh, we're gonna fight the slave power. And in Congress, there's a literal component to that. There are some Republicans who bring weapons to Congress, assuming that they're going to have to be, fighting the slave power up close and personal, because now they're going to be in a room talking about really contentious issues with Southerners with a long history of being violent and threatening. So when they said, running for Congress, I'm going to fight the slave power, there was a way in which they took that seriously. And what you see when you read correspondence to some of these Northern congressmen and between Northerners, and I saw this when I was researching my book, is Northerners essentially saying, finally, there is a North. Finally, someone is standing up for the North. Finally, there are people who are saying something and pushing back against what the Southerners have been doing for quite some time. The same sort of rush of satisfaction, a sort of visceral gut level sense of satisfaction. Finally, they're not taking it anymore. Even I remember having a historian friend read the final chapter of my book, which is where all of this happens when the Republican Party comes to power. And this friend of mine read the chapter, and we met to chat about what his thoughts were. And he said, quite literally, finally, these guys fight back. So even now in person reading a book, this person had that same kind of response. That's the kind of response that I've been seeing in response to what the Democratic Party is now doing. That's really interesting to me, right? That doesn't necessarily suggest we're seeing a permanent shift or a permanent change in the nature of democratic politicking, but it certainly is interesting that that kind of aggressive, hard-edged politicking, which has not been typical of Democrats, is getting a big response, particularly on social media. Interestingly, I went digging around online in preparing this. I was looking for the articles that we're going to be talking about this shift in dynamic, the change in tone, and there really aren't that many, right? People don't seem to have linked together Beto O'Rourke and John Fetterman and the White House tweets and President Biden's shift in rhetoric. People don't seem to be pulling all of those together yet in a pattern, but they're striking in the fact that they're all kind of happening at the same time. And I have been surprised talking about this on Twitter, and some people have said, yeah, well, the midterms are coming closer. It's like, yeah, that is true. And I'm sure we'll see more of it, and it will be more intense as the midterms come closer. But what we're also seeing is a way of politicking that the Democrats, who normally have assumed responsibility and taken responsibility for being the institutional caretakers, the responsible people, the people who follow the rules, that all of a sudden, they're not necessarily stepping forward and being violent, right? They're not going so far over the edge that they're doing what some of the worst people on the other side are doing, but they're not necessarily saying, no, like things we have to reach across the aisle, right? All of that talk that we've had for years, suddenly they're saying, you know what? Reaching across the aisle doesn't work. So here's what we say. That's a shift. And what we're now seeing, not surprisingly at all, is people on the right who are outraged about what's happening on the left. Again, fascinating, because the right has been engaging in that. Again, not everyone on the right, people on the extreme right have been engaging in much worse than what we're seeing on the left for a long time, right? I mean, they're physically threatening people. It's a whole different level what's going on among some people on the right. The left starts some mean talk, or at least what the right is saying is mean talk, which again, certainly is not any worse than things that have been said coming the other way from the right, but they're shocked. This shouldn't be happening. It's horrible. And again, that reminds me of the 1850s when the Northerners, who for so long had assumed, excuse me, accountability, responsibility for the role of being the institutional wardens, the people who were really going to always be proper. And so that people who were not going to follow the rules were going to do whatever they could do. They weren't held accountable for it at all. And partly that was because of threats and violence. Suddenly, the Democratic Party, at least some members of it, are saying, you know what? We aren't always the wardens. Sometimes we're going to push back. Sometimes we need to push back because now we're talking about democracy, right? It's a different level of things. And the stakes are high and the election's coming closer. And so maybe we're going to act and sound, or at least some of us will act and sound a little different. That doesn't necessarily mean, I think, that Democrats need to or should match the most extreme violence and threats coming on the right. But the shift in tone and the shock and horror that some on the right are expressing about it, granted, some of that is strategic and not sincere. Some of it is probably sincere. Why? Because suddenly the Democrats are doing what Democrats aren't supposed to do. That's not how the balance of power works. The balance of power works, according to a long-standing pattern in recent times, is that one side gets to be the sort of bullying, more violent side, and no one likes it. People denounce it, but there it is. And the other side tries to deal with it or appease it, or in one way or another, make it better. So suddenly, when the making it better side, the compromising, appeasing side says, you know what, right now is not a moment for compromising and appeasing. It makes sense that there's this sort of visceral gut response to it. I would predict, again, I'm not a modern day political prognosticator, but I would say generally based on the pattern and the response to it, one might expect to see more of this. And it's interesting, right? I don't know what that means. And it's tempting to say, great, Joanne. So in the late 1850s, the Northerners fought back and were aggressive and had weapons, and then we had a civil war, right? And I'm not saying excellent, like now both sides can go at each other like crazy people and then it'll all erupt into something bad. I'm actually not saying that. I think there's a spectrum of behavior from the absolutely unforgivable and undemocratic to the really, really appeasing and nice guy behavior. And I think if everybody goes onto this end of that spectrum, we're really doomed. And we aren't. There are some people who are here. There have been a lot of people on the left who were kind of hovering around but we have to be responsible end. And I'm not saying Democrats should be irresponsible, but the pushback and the big response to it is telling. And it exposes in interesting ways, I think, what we have accepted as the norm, which is the simple fact that the right, some on the right are more aggressive and more violent, and the left hasn't been, and that we've seen that as normal. So that now that that's not happening in the same way, people are wait, the degree to which people are expressing surprise shows the degree to which things had been in a sort of state of stasis where the left had the responsibility and accountability for government. So this response that we're seeing, it exposes the imbalance that we've taken as somehow being normal. It exposes the real hold, emotional hold that on the one hand, threats and bullying can have and have had, to the point that many on the left have been trying to figure out what to do in response to that and really not ultimately offering much, right? People have been frustrated and haven't been putting it in words. And I've talked many, many, many times. I think we said this is the 126th straight episode of History Matters. I've spoken many, many, many times about emotion, the power of emotion in politics, the ways in which in this particular moment, anger is being what one commentator called harvested, rage harvesting, that people are deliberately trying to get people angry. And again, this is some people on the right, deliberately trying to get people angry, and so that they'll be up in arms and they'll want to fight the bad guy. Now, that's not distinctive to the right, that's a political tool. But in this particular moment, again, the imbalance has been really obvious. So what this means, I can't say. What it exposes, the response to it, the change, how noticeable the change is, and the response to it. Again, I keep using the word fascinating because as a person who writes about political culture and is interested in language and technology, we're in my sweet spot right now. We're like right in the zone that I consider fascinating, because this is about the culture of politics, and the culture of politics fundamentally shapes the dynamics of politics, and that shapes everything, right? So this is, for that reason, interesting. I don't know where we're going to go, but it's a pattern that we have not in the recent times, very recent times, seen. We're watching on a daily basis what the response is. I guess I will end. I want to open things to questions. I will end by saying, more than anything else, I would say to watch and see where things go and what the pattern is. What happens? What happens within the Democratic Party? What impact does this kind of behavior have? Does it continue? Does it stop? Is it a handful of people who are sort of acting as, aggressive fighters and everybody else doesn't have to be. That's also something that happened in the 1850s, particularly on the side of the South. There would be certain men who were sort of the designated bullies, right? And that they came to Congress and they wanted to make a reputation for themselves that way. And roughly 10% of any Congress, based on my rough calculation, were these, designated fighters who the hero of my book, the clerk, who provided so many records for me about that Congress, Benjamin Brown French, and he was associated with Congress in one way or another, clerking and otherwise for decades. When a new Congress came in, French would try and pick the fighting men, right? He would very explicitly, they were fighting men using their words and non-combatants, again, using their words. And French, along with everybody else, would be trying to figure out who the fighting men were and who the non-combatants were, because that was going to shape what happened in Congress. So we're at another moment, a moment of extreme emotion, a moment of very high stakes. And I think that's true. I don't think this is hyperventilating people on the left saying, oh no, democracy is at risk. Democracy is at risk. I think that's just a fact. So we're at that kind of a moment and we're watching one response to that. And fortunately and unfortunately, we're going to be seeing the response to that and what it means and what it adds up to in real time. So watch for patterns on both left and right, rather than just going with the flow of whatever emotion is being poured out. Watch, I've said this a lot of times before too, watch to see not only what people are saying and doing that might get an emotional rise out of you, but why they're doing it. Don't just sweep into the flow of emotion. Think about the strategy behind why people are saying or doing what they're saying or doing. What is the logic behind what's happening? Why is this person choosing this tone? And that would be true, again, think about that on left and right. What does it suggest about the contest, the rules of the current contest, the shifting rules of the current contest, the things that we accept as normal or acceptable and how that might be changing? Allow yourself to step back and think about the pattern, again, like a historian, the patterns in what we're seeing and what they suggest, particularly in times like now in recent years. We have to be smart consumers of politics. We can't just indulge ourselves and get swept away on emotion. So yeah, people are saying, finally, I said, okay, fine. Now step back from that and let's think about what's happening and what it means. Be smart consumers of this political moment, of the politics rushing around us. That's, I guess, will be my closing comment, because I do want to open things up to questions. I actually, for some reason, I'm not seeing normally the comments of people saying mug.
Oh, there's mug. It's up there.
Oh yeah, no, but normally it's on the bottom of my screen, and for some reason
gotcha.
it isn't. I don't know why, but again, for those who are new, for 126 straight weeks, I've managed
My
to
100th anniversary mug.
excellent. I've managed to have a mug that in one way or another relates to the theme. It does not mean I have 126 mugs. There's been definite repeat. This one hasn't seen the light of day for a while, but it relates to today. And it says, funny, I don't recall asking for your opinion, which pretty much felt on target.
I love that whole series.
This is wonderful.
So
but this
great.
particularly,
That's
we're
perfect.
playing a rougher game, and I don't really remember asking if you like it or not.
That is really good.
So that
Do you
is
remember who gave that? Is that one that you picked out or someone sent you? Do you remember?
someone sent it to me, and I know that Slack.
Somebody in the chat will tell us who it was.
Someone will tell it who it was. I'm going to open up chat
Oh my
again.
gosh, that might be one of my favorite mugs ever.
I literally climbed up on a ladder to go into the depths of my cabinet because I was like, I must have the right mug, and
That's right.
this one appeared. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Well, we definitely have tons of great questions. I'm going to give you an easy one first. Kathy Callahan, and I'm not sure where Kathy's from, if she'll put that in the chat. She wanted to know more of like why you chose the label snarky. And my follow-up question was, the kids always talk about throwing shade. That's what they,
Mhm.
the current kids that we teach.
Right.
So is snarky coming back, or what did you mean by snarky? And I guess I'm wondering, is snarky the same as shade, or is it different? Because a lot of people were saying the White House was throwing shade.
Throwing shade. Well,
So I don't
think
know.
this is generational. This is older person using terms that she sees and maybe missing the undercurrent. I mean, and you'll notice if you go back, because this ultimately, again, for newcomers, this whole this whole conversation will be posted online. And I bet if you go back, when I said snarky, I think I qualified it by saying not in a bad way or something like that, because as it came out of my mouth, I thought, oh, snarky might not be the right word, right? Yeah. Same thing with shade. In both cases, there's malicious intent attached to it, which I'm not saying isn't necessarily accurate, but those words get tossed around a lot, and it's worth thinking about how we use them. So in the case, and this is a great example, actually, it's a great question. This is a great example of thinking about what people say and how they say it. If someone had asked me this at the beginning, I might not have used the word snarky. And as I said it, I felt funny about it. That's a good question. Because also the levels, the layers, subtle and not so subtle of what we're saying in the way we're describing what people are doing. There are a lot of layers, and you can just see how that one word can say a lot of things that I didn't even necessarily intend. So it's partly, an old person using words that she sees other people using, but also it seemed to fit because it's, hard edged, doesn't have the zing, but it's a good question. Well,
Ellen says degree of snark is a phrase that she will now use moving forward. I think degree of snark along with man of scalp are our next two mugs. Personally.
On the snark scale.
All right, now I have to make a graphic of the snark scale and post it on
snark scale. Let's get a 6 on the snark scale. Yeah.
Okay, so Charles Catalano, who I also am not familiar with Charles, so this might be a new person. I don't remember. And
actually, let me say before you ask the question, you said this at the outset. If there are people here who are new, tell us you are new, because this community of people have been coming here every week for 126 weeks. We'll welcome you into this community. We want to welcome you in. So let us know. Anyway, okay.
Okay, so Charles Catalano is a new friend to me. Don't know if he's new to the group, but I think this is his first question, at least since I started hanging out in this capacity. He says, considering the similarities to the 1850s with the escalation in tone now paralleling the shift in tone in 1855, how might civility be restored short of a Civil War victory by one side?
Well, so this is a good question, because civility is another word that to me has a lot of meanings. And people sometimes use it without specifying which meaning they intend. So civility sometimes is used as don't push back, don't be rude, don't just make nice. Or civility can mean not being violent. There's a whole spectrum. And the reason I mention that is because, for example, I think I've said this before, is it civil for someone to refuse, for Rosa Parks to refuse to go to the back of the bus? Is it civil for Ida B. Wells to, bite the conductor his arm when he tries to grab her out of a seat on a train? Is that civil? We could have a discussion about that, but some people would say, no, those things aren't civil. And yet, I don't know about the biting, although someone was physically pulling her off the train, refusing to move to the back of the bus, protesting loudly, with a gallows, again, not being physically violent, but being really, like there were hecklers last night during the president's speech, right? There are all kinds of things that people might say, that's not exactly civil, but some level of protest and pushback is part of democracy, whether we like the people doing the pushing or not. So as far as how we get from where we are to a point when people are actually able to talk to each other, part of the answer to that question has to do with who gets put into office. right? Part of that question has to do with us. The way that we got angrier Northerners is because people elected them to Congress, right? People were like, that's what we want. We want fighters. So it's not as though it's magically happening at the national center. What's happening at the center is a reflection of what people are giving. So part of the answer is us. How do we get to somewhere different? If Americans ultimately get tired of this level of horn blowing, tire screeching, outrage, and if people step forward, not necessarily saying let's all make nice, but I'm not going to be the person that punches you in the face, a low bar. But if people step forward with an explicitly different and yet relevant and suitable tone, and people vote for that person, we see a shift in tone. So ultimately, I know this is an easy answer. Ultimately, it's a big chunk of this is on us and who we vote for. That's not, vote is not the answer to all of our problems, but it has a big influence.
So show up and vote. Yeah.
Well, and vote and think about why you're voting for who you're voting for, right? So policy matters a lot, but so does politics, meaning the mode of politicking of the people who we vote for. And if we're in a moment where you want to vote for Democrats who are, more of a fighting kind of person, and that's the moment that we're in, then that's the choice you make. But it's worth at least being aware that that's what you're doing and not blindly doing it and then wondering, why we are where we are.
All right. So Gloria has a clarification question for you. She was wondering about, you said something about slave power, and she wondered, were you saying that Republicans today are the slave power?
I wasn't explicitly saying that. I mean, slave power was the 1850s phrase that referred to the fact that Southerners were like block formation united on the question of slavery, and they dominated the government for decades, and that was the slave power, that they seemed to control everything. I suppose what the connection I was making is, if the Southerners were in fighting the slave power, or people who were consistently threatening violence, and joining, people weren't stepping forward from the South and saying, don't do that anymore, right? That people were either being aggressive and nasty or sitting back and letting that happen in this time period. It's the dynamic that I'm linking. I'm saying that there are many on part of the right that are violent, that are threatening hospitals and school boards and, people who work at the polls and teachers and senators and everybody else, right? Who are getting threatened, physically threatened in one way or another, or threatened in phone calls. And that represents the same kind of dynamic that in a way we don't like it, but it's just sort of become part of the noise of politics right now, which is kind of shocking. Came out last night, right, when the president said, none of that kind of violence is actually acceptable. The fact that had to be said is a little shocking in and of itself. But so that was the comparison I was making with the people who have gotten in essence permission to break a lot of rules and push really hard on one side, and that's what the quote unquote slave power were doing, while the other side somehow was given full responsibility for being nice and keeping things going.
Yeah, somebody in the chat just mentioned, and it flew by too quick, that the person who defeated Sarah Palin purposefully in her candidate materials said something about a return to niceness, and that was a big reason that they were able to defeat that particular candidate. So that was a good connection in the chat. Okay, so Dave has questions. He's submitted a couple. One thing I think is more a comment, Dave, I'm not going to call this a question. He says, so the Dems are not labeled as bullies, he's asking, but his big question is, how should today's Democrats respond to MAGA Republicans so they are more like Northerners finally pushing back in the 1850s?
Well, I think, and again, I talk about politics from several hundred years ago, but I would say, speaking only in the we will reach across the aisles mode alone with nothing else there, at this particular moment, unaided by other more complicated messages of some kind, might not resonate right now, right? That in some way or another, saying, we're always going to be the nice guys and we're not going to push back in any way. I think that message defeats the sense of urgency that I think this moment needs. And that's in a sense part of what we're seeing, at least with the White House, the president, and that kind of rhetoric, is a uptick in the acknowledgement of the urgency of the situation. The difficulty in talking about that urgency, and I said this a long time ago, and I've chatted about this with Heather Cox Richardson, and that is we've been very careful in the tone of our comments, our public commentary, because, and I thought this at a very early point, if I came out too loud and too strong about the threat that I honestly see, if I did that too early, people wouldn't hear it anymore after a certain point, and it wouldn't seem true, because it would be like, yeah, there they are again. And people are already saying that still. There they are again, saying this is the most important election in our lifetime, blah, blah, blah. I have people respond to me that way sometime. So as a public commentator, over the years, I thought very hard about the tone of what I was saying, because I didn't want urgency to become the norm in rhetoric and thus to be ignored and invisible. And now, with the midterms coming up, you could say that we always hear that it's the most important election, blah, 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 but it's a really, really important election. And if you do, as I've been encouraging people to do over the course of the years that we've been together here, if you step back and you look at patterns and you put them together and you see things, particularly some things on the extreme right. What did I just see? That there's a right-wing think tank that is having a sheriff training fellowship where sheriffs are going to get these fellowships and they can learn to resist the radical left, because what we really want are trained law enforcement
with
people.
guns. Yeah.
Right. So think about things that you see and what they are, how much of it there is, and think about the pattern of that, rather than each side screaming, as often happens, and we see it all the time, you're the fascist. No, you're the fascist. That's not going to get us anywhere. But if you add up actions that are like that, why do we need to politically train sheriffs? That's really not encouraging to me in many ways. Why are we threatening senators and leaving threatening phone calls? Why are hospitals being targeted? Why things that are happening, note them and think about the pattern and what that suggests. You don't have to go into it with a political agenda, though we all have very strong political thoughts right now, but you don't even have to go in with that to track behavior. And, when people say, well, you on the left, you're a bunch of fascists. Okay, well, then they need to talk about what to them seems as though it's fascist. And there was a tweet recently that was like, I can't even remember what it was. Sort of, you folks on the left, I can't even remember what it was. Like, you always do blah. And my response was, I'd be really interested in what the blah is, not in a snarky way, but what qualifies as that? Like, what is the thing? So think about actual behavior, actual politics, actual trends, and figure out what they suggest and what they show, rather than just tossing back and forth epithets and insults that, who's the fascist. I've talked about this a lot too, and it's another thing that I'm interested in is words, the word choice we make. For example, is it a riot or an insurrection or a coup or whatever? The words that we use matter a lot too. which is why it's important to actually look at what's happening. And rather than tossing off labels, I think authoritarian, fascist, communist, all of these words no longer have any meaning. They're just like insults being thrown without any meaning at all. Actually, critical race theory falls into that category too, of things that don't have a meaning. And it's actually the lack of a meaning that makes them so powerful and useful, because you can say, you commies, really,
Archie Bunker almost.
well, right. So it's these words being tossed around without meaning because they have kind of a punch to them, a cultural punch to them. Again, another reason why step away from the words and look at the actions and think about what they add up to.
Yeah, Gloria had put something in the chat about she thinks we should be teaching children how to, kind of be civically engaged and stand up for what they believe in. But my comment back to her was, we do that, and now that's been labeled CRT. Like you were saying, CRT has no meaning. That used to be a big part of civic education, was teaching kids peaceful protest and First Amendment. But now, if you include that in a lesson plan, and 14 states have now created laws saying you can't teach that anymore. So it's like, how are we supposed to teach you to be a good citizen? Okay, this folds right into Miranda's next question. She says, do you think it'll take a Charles Sumner type event before the public as a whole realize just how much the rhetoric has been ramped up?
Boy, wow.
Yeah,
that's a question.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I can't say yes or no. What I can say again is, looking over the long term, very often there's one symbolic event that rouses people. Again, emotion rouses people in some kind of a way that it becomes a wave. Not just, oh, look, Democrats are more aggressive, but something that like your senator in Congress being beaten to the ground by a Southerner, right? That there were, in the North, there were protest meetings about that, but what they were called was indignation meetings, because that's what they were. They were meetings of people being indignant about the way that the North was being treated, because Sumner's treatment on the floor of the Senate, in the mind of the North, was how the North was being treated, being beaten down. You look over the longer term and you see, a ship being sunk somewhere, and that gets everyone riled up, and suddenly you're moving towards war, or a seeming bribe being asked for on the part of Americans, and you get the quasi-war. But very often there is a thing that either in a sincere kind of a way is shocking, or is used to be that kind of shocking moment that sparks the kinds of emotions that push things. But I don't think you can predict that. You might be able to predict that people might be trying to find, I mean, in a sense, if you're tossing around words to see, spaghetti meet wall, what's going to stick? Again, it means we have to step back and think about what's being said and why it's being said and who's saying it. But so the short answer is, will some big dramatic event like that have a serious impact? I don't know, but I suppose it could, right? It could. Now, what's interesting about the caning of Sumner is the response was twofold. So on the one hand, the North was outraged, indignant, indignation meetings about what happened, and that the North was being beaten into submission. Preston Brooks, the person who did the beating, was praised in the South, was sent honorary canes, one of which I believe came from the University of Virginia and had inscribed on the top of it, oh no, I'm taking this back, this is another occasion, but there was a UVA cane that had a head and a cane coming down on it, right? Like, yay, Preston Brooks. So the bully, right, the violent people also got cheered on. We don't often remember that part, but that was part of that moment too. So it wasn't even just now the North is electrified. It was the North and the South now feel as though the discussion has moved to a different level. I will say here, I see we're coming close to the end. I will say here something that I said on the Velshi show on MSNBC 2 weeks ago. I don't like all of the talk about civil war, because I think that does a number of things, none of them particularly useful. it suggests some kind of official, it takes away the ways in which some of what we're seeing now are just extremist violence. If you're like, it's a civil war, you're adding in, sort of causes and structure and formality and, in a sense, even, I don't want to say approval or endorsement, but recognition, right? That this is an event, it's a kind of event, and here is that kind of event happening. I don't think that's useful. I think that's using, in a sense, a history mask to hide some of the ugliness and extremity of what we're seeing now. It's not civil war, it's extremist violence, and that's not as sacred sounding and not as structured sounding, and more, I think, in line with what we're seeing. But so I know that people constantly want to ask, are we headed towards civil war? When I talk about the 1850s, I move us right into that zone. But I don't think that's the question to ask right now. And I don't think whatever happens, if you think of a civil war as a neat fight between two sides, there's no line you can draw across the country, right? We're in a different world. So for a whole bunch of reasons, I don't think that's a useful.
A lot of people were saying that they felt like the Charles Sumner moment was January 6th. Somebody earlier posted in the chat that actually even before that, that there was a heckler during one of Obama's speeches that yelled out, "You lie," and it was very clearly heard. And they thought that was sort of the beginning of it, but many people are.
I think that was a member of Congress. I think that
it was
Wilson. Yeah, in Congress, who said, "You lie." Yeah, well, there are moments like that that become, and sure, January 6th, you would think would be that moment, and I think for many people it was, but some people are still debating what actually happened, right? It would be as though people step forward and say, well, Sumner was faking it. I mean, he wasn't hurt that bad, which actually people said at the time. Afterwards, they were like, he's faking it. He's, acting like he's so sick and so beaten so that they can play it up. It's like, not so much.
Yeah. All right, we've got a few more questions. I know we're running out of time. This one comes from Cece. She asked if your work, Joanne, has similar examples of hypocrisy, such as McConnell refusing to vote on SCOTUS in election year, then pushing Amy Coney Barrett in at the last minute, things like that. If so, how does that play out? It feels like there's no pushback and it frustrates her as a historian.
Well, I mean, part of my answer, my instant, not fully thought through answer is hypocrisy is politics, right? Has there ever been a moment? But the question, or it sounds like the question that you're asking really, is this very obvious, explicit, I've always done X, and then saying I've never done X, or I will always do this, and then coming out and saying I will never do this. That there's a level of in your face lying or misleading without any sense of embarrassment about it, right? This is something that, again, it's lying isn't new to politics, hypocrisy isn't new to politics, but the degree to which people are very loudly and proudly and openly lying about things that are on video, right? It's like, I didn't do that. It's like, yeah, we have it on film. You did it, or you never said that. It's like, here you are saying it. The degree to which that happens, I think for everybody, and particularly, I think historians who are like, but evidence. We have evidence.
Yeah, that makes me think of, living here in Charlottesville, and we just had the 5th anniversary of what happened here with the Unite the Right rally. And there's a lot of people that point to that time as when it started becoming okay to say those things out loud in public, like there's nothing wrong with it, and exhibiting that level of violence and then saying it was a peaceful protest. So it's not just one thing. It's a cumulative, I think. It's hard.
And it's, again, how we're describing it in part. I want to go back here because Greg said something interesting that someone else pointed out was interesting as well. Could the overruling of Roe be equivalent to the Dred Scott decision? Now, I don't like making exact, this is like this and this is like this. However, if what that question is essentially asking is what Dred Scott did, and what the fugitive slave law did, what those moments did, was make the enforcement, the protection of slavery northern. The Fugitive Slave Act, if there was an enslaved person who ran north and a northerner found that person, Fugitive Slave Act, they were compelled to send that person back south. Suddenly, northerners were being raked into the protection of slavery in a way that they hadn't been before. It became personal and it became local. And in that sense, I think for some who maybe were not plugged into, I will now control my face, were not plugged into women's rights in any way. Now, what that did do is take an issue that for many probably they hadn't thought about or didn't concern them. I don't necessarily agree with that take on things, but it became local, it became personal, it became something that could happen everywhere. The implications of that changed the level and the nature of the conversation. So if the question is the overturning of Roe, has that really fundamentally changed the dynamics of the conversation? And is that going to be a charge moment for Americans to say, whoa, like this is me? Maybe. I mean, it's been interesting just to watch recent contests, the defeat of Sarah Palin and some of what happened in Kansas. And maybe, I mean, every moment can be history, but we're living in particularly historic times. Patterns thrown to the wind, new weird things happening that we're in the middle of it. And so we can't always see sort of where things are drifting. But this falls into that category as well for me, I suppose.
Yeah. We have so many really good questions left. That breaks my heart because I know it's after 11, but do you want
to do a little bit more?
Okay. Yeah. I'm trying to pick people that we don't always hear from. So Linus is a fairly new member to the community. He talks about studies of honor culture as a sociologist, who frames the way people talk and treat their honor. So the South have honor traditions like the Sumner caning, besmirching of honor justifies the violent response. And then the topic that we had on toxic masculinity recently. And he says, do you see the gap in these responses from right and left seeming to be a question of culture? And Rabbi Beth also asked a similar question about is Biden's criticisms, behaving more manly, less. So that those two I'm going to kind of combine, Beth and Linus, if you guys don't mind.
Well, right. That's again, right up my alley.
I know, right?
I know, because I've always
didn't let those two go. They were so good.
No, I've always been interested in honor culture. And indeed, if you look at the scholarly literature, there's a lot of discussion of Southern honor culture having its own ethos and dynamic. And it's more, there's a sort of man to man, and I use man very deliberately, sort of personal component of it and a violent component to it. And that this is directly tied in, as was just suggested, to masculinity, and manhood gets linked in as well. If you go back to the 19th century, there were very different ideas of manhood in the North and in the South. This part of what I was interested in studying Congress was what happens when different views of legality and violence and manhood come up against each other in the House of Representatives. Like, what happens over a violent issue? What happens? So, generally speaking, I would say, yeah, there are patterns like that, but I hesitate to say, I hesitate to pin the pattern that we're seeing now necessarily on honor culture explicitly. I would say the logic of honor culture is interwoven with everything that we're seeing right now. And when people are saying you need to be civil, people who have been attacked are saying you need to be civil. In part, what they're saying is, I've been humiliated. Like, my reputation has been attacked, right? I've been shown to be. There's a performative element mixed in with the nasty politics. And that's one of the things, honor culture, what matters in honor culture is how other people treat you. If you are a person with honor, you are treated with respect. If you are a person without honor, you are a lesser sort of person. So that's some of what we're seeing now. And again, the sort of gut level personal component of how some people are responding to things that don't necessarily need that kind of response. There's an honor culture component to it. And honor culture isn't the same across all time. So I can't say, yeah, like in the Congress in the first half of the 19th century, they were worried about and using honor culture words and codes and rituals as politics, which they were. I would say now it's more on a personal, human, and thus less obvious level that people are plugging into the sort of feelings behind honor culture, that if you humiliate someone or attack someone politically, that's a personal attack. And related to that, honor culture, there's a contagion to it. So if you humiliate a person, you might humiliate that person's family. If you humiliate someone who's the top of a party, you might humiliate that person's party by contagion. The document that starts my most recent book, one of the things that it says is that the head of the Republican Party was constantly being attacked and he didn't fight back. And these three other Republicans say, it was attacking our manhood. It was humiliating us. The fact that he was being dishonored in that way. So all of this is part of what we're seeing now. This is the kind of sort of good cultural stuff that isn't always woven into how some people think about hard politics. And we're in a moment where that really offers a lot.
All right, it's 11:05. Do we want one more question or do we need to segue into the after party? What do you think?
Maybe one, I know we're going late. One more question because we still have.
Okay, says, hi, Dave, completely new person here. Yay. David, excuse me. What are your thoughts on the undercurrent of frustration behind the finally reaction to Biden's speech? Is it fair to say the response to the White House has been a bit lackluster in response to Republican lack of civility or threats to democracy? So the whole finally.
So in essence, should they have been acting rougher all along?
Yeah.
Again, that's a should. I mean, my partial answer, I guess, is not necessarily. I don't think you plunge into that. I don't think that should be where you lead from. I don't think you lead from bang. I think that response has a sense of righteousness to it if it's responding to a pattern of abuse. That's what people are feeling now. I think, the fact that the Democrats, in a sense, have been accountable or feeling accountable or responsible for maintaining things and reaching across aisles and, obeying rules, that has led to kind of an imbalance of power. But I don't think you could get where we are now in that's the word I want to use, in a logical way, without watching how the balance of power is playing out and finally having people step forward and saying, this has been the balance of power, and now we're going to shake things up a little bit. I think finally there's a sense of sort of righteous, yeah, and that's because of the history of the opposite of that happening. And again, I don't think you lead with the violence and the threats. I don't think you lead with, oh yeah. I think you have to earn that. I think it has to have a reason behind it. I think it has to be a logical response rather than a normal mode of conducting politics.
All right, John, is there a way to save the extra questions? I know I can save the chat, but is there a way you can pull these up for us? Because there's just so many good ones that we didn't get to. Anyway.
I mean, I can cut and paste them into like a Word doc.
Okay. Maybe send them and then if there's some that Joanne really wants to chew on and respond to, maybe. I mean, there really are some good ones left.
I'm sure this is a great
out of 18. Yeah, there's still 8 more good ones. All right, so do you want to give the segue?
I will give the spiel. Yes, the segue. Okay. So those of you who are here for the first time, here's what happens now. We will segue from the more formal aspect of our program into what we call the after party. And what that means is we will no longer be recording. so we can be a little freer and easier with our comments. We can talk about whatever the heck it is we want to talk about. It's a lot more conversational. It's a time where the community can really talk to each other as a community. If you are beaming in from Facebook, you need to leave Facebook to join the after party. You need to go to ncheteach.org/conversations, and you will instantly, poof, be in the after party. Those of you who have come in through that URL, through that website, just stay right where you are, and we will become the after party within mere moments. I will also say, as I always say, with great sincerity, thank you for coming here on a Friday morning to engage in the conversation of democracy, to talk about what's happening, there we go. Annie has it in right on her mug, to talk about what's happening, to think about historical resonance and what it might teach us, to criticize and comment on and evaluate and rethink and school each other on things, to grapple with the I know I'm saying contingency, someone's getting bingo, to grapple with the contingency of this moment. This is a difficult moment to be in. We are all, regardless of our politics, anxious for good reason right now. Thank you all for being here to do one of the things democracy does best, which is enable citizens to come together and work things out. I appreciate this community, always have, always will. And I hope that everybody has a wonderful week. This week, I do not know what I'm going to talk about next time. So I'll figure that out, because magically the news seems to always provide something. But regardless, I hope if there are new folks, please do come back next Friday when we will do this again. And actually, I should say also, if there are new folks, all of the past episodes, all 125 of them, are all archived online at the same place you went to beam in today, ncheteach.org/conversations. All of the past episodes are there if you are interested in any of the past topics we talked about.
So Joanne, this week, oh wait, I'm gonna let John stop the recording. There we go. Nope, he's still recording.